Broadband Breakfast Live Online for Wednesday, December 16th, 2020. I'm Drew Clark. I'm in Washington, D.C. It's snowing outside, but we are still having Broadband Breakfast Live Online. Amazing how broadband works that way. We are very excited to have a great continuation of our Tools for Broadband Deployment series. This is a 5-part series that we kicked off in October and will continue into February. And we're basically drilling into some of the specifics of how and why and all of those good things that people who are getting involved in broadband networks, particularly fiber networks, but all sorts, the tools they need to make successful projects. We are here. Broadband Breakfast Live Online is here every Wednesday, including the next 2 Wednesdays, with some special shows that I'll give some more details about later on. But this series, which is sponsored by Edtran and Render Networks, has been running, as I said, from October. We had a great episode last month as well, and we'll continue again in January and in February. I wanted to remind you that you can stay apprised of all of our events by signing up to Broadband Breakfast, our news alerts, and you'll be able to use this link that you've gotten for this event for other events. So thank you for being with us in person or watching from Broadband Breakfast Live Online. With that, I want to go ahead and turn to our panelists. We have a very topical discussion today. When we structured this, we said we wanted to do it on RDOF, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and other rural broadband deployments. So we won't be limited to that. But obviously, since we set the schedule, the FCC announced that the bidding had concluded and the award winners were announced for $9 billion of the $16 billion that was available. So they spent less money. And we'll talk, we may talk a little bit about some of the aspects and some of the issues that arose there. But more importantly, we want you and our panelists to focus on what are the specific steps that need to be taken in terms of laying the groundwork and managing deployments in a budgetary and execution fashion. So with that, let's go ahead and turn to Lori Sherwood. Lori is the Director of Commercial and Market Development at Render Networks. We had a chance to hear from her last month, but we're pleased to have her back again. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts on our topic here of RDOF and other broadband deployments.
Great, thank you, Drew. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, depending on where you are. And thank you for having me here today. I'm delighted to participate with this terrific panel. I don't want to take too much time up with this introduction, so we can spend the majority of our time in a discussion. But I just like to start for a moment on kind of taking a step back and providing a level set on where we are. Gratefully, we're about to turn the page on 2020, which is a good time to pause for a moment of reflection. You know, since the start of the new millennium, every decade, it seems as though there has been a significant disruptive event that has overwhelmed our industry. You know, in the early 2000s, it was the dot-com bust. 10 years later, it was the recovery from the Great Recession. And of course, this year, the COVID pandemic. Fortunately, our industry has seemingly thrived through the majority of these significant events, particularly because they all relate to the fact that we need broadband infrastructure. You know, 10 years ago, we had the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act that pushed $4+ billion out for broadband infrastructure. And this year, we are seeing, of course, an increasing amount of funds being spent by state legislatures, by the federal government on making sure that folks are connected. You know, going back to March, it seems literally overnight, our world changed and everyone went from working in offices and school to doing everything from home. And those without a robust broadband connection are certainly being left behind. And it's urgent, of course, issue for us to resolve. So now we have all of these federal programs that are coming out. Of course, RDOF was not the result of the pandemic. It had been planned prior to that. But it is just timely. So we have $9 billion that are being awarded through that initial RDOF fund. Looking ahead to next year, we have $10 billion or more potentially in federal infrastructure grant money, billions in state grant programs. So there's, the bottom line here is that there's a lot of work, a lot of money that's coming into the industry, and it's, our jobs as sort of stewards of this to be able to manage these projects effectively and do what we need to do to get everybody connected. Now turning to RDOF for a moment, those who participated in the program, who received awards, are now busy working on their long form applications. They're looking at everything from putting together their project plans to thinking about deployment and how they're going to manage the project in a way that meets all the project milestones and requirements. And so I think, today I look forward to sort of delving into what that means and all of the things that folks need to consider, from materials shortages to backlogs to crews to making sure that you have all the resources you need to effectively roll out your project with the least amount of stress. And so, I think all of these issues are going to permeate our discussion today. And with that, Drew, I think I'd like to turn it back to you for the rest of the introductions so that we can get to the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Lori. Let's go ahead and roll over to our next panelist, Ryan McCowan. Ryan is the Director of Customer Engagement and Solutions for Edtran. Tell us a little bit about Edtran and about the role that you all play in this ecosystem of broadband deployment.
All right, thanks, Drew. So here at Edtran, we make and sell communications infrastructure equipment. So the equipment that goes at the service provider end of the fiber line, as well as the customer premise equipment. So the technology that's used to light up the fiber, as well as the software that's used to manage the network once you've built out this great network, is sort of the area where Edtran fits into this ecosystem. And RDOF is coming at a really timely point here. The pandemic has driven a lot of temporary changes in the way that we work and live, but I think it's also going to drive some structural changes as well. From the temporary perspective, we've got, about 42% of American workers are still working remotely, but that 42% covers almost 2/3 of GDP. The way that they're working at home or working not at the office is also changing in interesting ways. The sales of backyard sheds are up 400% from last year. The sales of Airstream trailers are up 100% year over year. People are leaving the office, and they're doing so in creative ways. But they're not just leaving the office. In some places, they're also making bigger changes in where they live. If you look at rental prices in cities, particularly like New York and San Francisco, the rental markets there are nearly collapsing, 30-40% decreases in rental prices. Rural communities have the opportunity to capture those professionals who are leaving the big cities for the improved quality of life, the lower cost of living that comes from smaller towns. But the thing that they need in order to make that work with their careers and their lifestyle is great broadband. So RDOF is a wonderful opportunity to capitalize on that trend and give smaller communities a new lease on life and a new breath of fresh air in terms of being able to attract these folks who are leaving cities. And as RDOF winners and other folks who are building out rural infrastructure start to build out those networks, we can help make sure that you're providing a future-proof network. So you don't want to spend all this money to build a fiber network and then activate services over it, build infrastructure using that fiber network that's going to have to be replaced in a couple of years. You want to be able to have a network that's going to help you get a return on the investment that you're making over the next decade plus, and fill it up with technology that offers your customers a premium experience, and also the ability to manage that experience to make sure all of the Wi-Fi devices in the house are getting great coverage and great speed. And designing that network and populating it with all the technology that turns glass in the ground into internet that fills the house.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I love the details about the backyard sheds and the Airstream trailers. What you touched upon, Ryan, really underscores part of our motto here at Broadband Breakfast is better broadband, better lives. And so we really need to be planning for the highest capacity possible. And so that's clearly a message that's begun to get through, and that's sort of been the stated aim of RDOF is to tilt towards highest capacity gigabit symmetrical. Let's hear now from Ed Barrett, who's Vice President and Practice Leader for HR Green's Fiber and Broadband Practice. Ed, tell us a little bit about your take on some of these rural broadband deployments. Ed, you're on mute right now, so go ahead and unmute there. There you go. Thank you.
Of course, 9 months later, and we still forget the mute button. So I think the panelists that have already spoken have done a great job of hitting on what we've seen as some of the key trends in the marketplace. HR Green provides planning, consulting, engineering, and deployment services for municipalities, electric co-ops, and private ISPs. So we sort of work across the industry, but as a company, our parent company is very heavily involved in the municipal sector, as are we from a planning and feasibility perspective. And I think probably at a high level, the thing that I think has really been ground changing, that the pandemic has really laid out is, 2 years ago when we were talking to partner communities about the problems they had to solve, right? Broadband networks were, with a bit of an eye sort of cast as why would we spend all that money to improve somebody's Netflix and, let their kids go, run streaming online games. Like that was kind of what broadband was about. And, now the pandemic, I think, has really brought into a sharp focus some of the things Ryan pointed out, that broadband isn't just about your kids and and entertainment. I mean, this is fundamental to people's ability to work remotely. It's about kids and school. It's about economic development, and I think that fundamentally at some level it's about survival of communities and differentiation and economic development. So we've seen our clients become more and more tuned into this. And I think that's probably brought in some ways this disconnect between federal money that's intended to solve these problems on one hand, and on the other, with high levels of urgency. And on the other hand, this reality that some of the solutions, many of the solutions that we bring to people, government, anchor institutions, require long polls, right? I had a friend once, in response to some of the CARES money that came out, say that the policymakers sometimes don't realize that 9 women in 1 month does not make a baby. And I took that to heart. It's some of these things take time. They take planning, they take deployment. And I think particularly in an environment where 5G fiber deployment is not going to slow down. The deployment of these RDOF networks are not going to slow down. Other funded networks, there's funding momentum at Capitol Hill for another round of broadband infrastructure spend. And I think the thing that I would say is probably most crucial is if people are not recognizing the fact that you're going to have to plan more and more ahead to implement these things, you know, the days of let me get the team together and next month we can be designing and building are probably gone. You know, there's going to be material shortages, fiber lead times are out past 26, 28 weeks now. That's going to get longer. You know, it's going to require people to think differently about how to deploy these networks that are being funded, with a lot more planning and a lot more emphasis putting on teams that can deliver kind of macro solutions for them. So, and I'm super excited about hearing the questions people have about what we're seeing and what our other panelists are seeing. Thanks for having me, Drew.
Thank you, Ed. Very much appreciate your perspective on this. Batting cleanup, and perhaps our secret weapon for this discussion is Greg Santoro, Chief Marketing and Strategy Officer for NRTC, which he originally stood for National Rural Telephone Cooperative, but I'm sure goes by a much broader name. Greg, talk to us a little bit about your perspective on this from the expertise you've brought, your previous work with Nextel International, and how co-ops are really rising to the challenge of higher capacity broadband.
Sure, thanks, Drew. Just so folks know, NRTC is actually a technology cooperative. We've been in business over 30 years, providing a wide range of technology services to rural America. Everything from broadband, mobile, smart grid and managed network services to almost 2,000 electric cooperatives, as well as telephone cooperatives and small rural companies across the country. So we very much understand the challenges that rural companies and rural members have when it comes to everything from gaining access to great cellular networks, broadband networks, and being able to deliver reliable and cost-effective energy services to rural areas. So in particular, this past year has been an incredibly difficult year for everybody, but it has really showcased how important specifically broadband is for rural areas. We offer a help desk service as a part of our managed services portfolio, and we have about 460 of our members who sign up for help desk service, and we saw a 50% increase in the number of calls coming into our call center from folks and members trying to get established with decent broadband service, get their home office network set up, and being able to be productive in a virtual environment. And then we saw significant increases in traffic, obviously because of the increase in video and other broadband services, which put a huge strain on the current networks that exist in rural areas, and really showcases the need for things like RDOF and CARES and the other funding mechanisms to improve broadband infrastructure throughout these areas. So, I mean, there's still 20 million people who just don't have access to great broadband. And, a lot of companies like the folks here on this call, as well as others who are trying to do their best to serve those needs. And again, we're right in the middle of doing that and focused on serving, over 10 million homes passed and trying to deliver better broadband. And then through a combination of technologies, whether it be fiber or mixed fiber hybrid services. And specifically when we talk about electric cooperatives, they're both leading the charge and trying to help drive consumer broadband services to their membership. But at the same time, they realize that in order to deliver sort of next generation energy services, they have to have a better communications infrastructure. So you're seeing investments in backbone networks, in particular fiber, as well as wireless networks, to be able to get more real-time connectivity to substations and other downline energy devices, so that they can more quickly manage the electric environment and in real time assess the needs across their companies, and at the same time use some of that infrastructure to be able to deliver consumer broadband for the members that need it. So we're involved in that. We think the electric cooperatives, as well as the telecommunications cooperatives and companies, are central to achieving better broadband connectivity throughout all of rural America, and just happy to be a part of that important mission.
Well, thank you. I'm going to make sure here as we modify our displays here and just get our group here. I wanted to ask a quick question of Greg and say, in regards to RDOF, obviously a week ago, the announcement came that the FCC had, as part of this reverse auction process, $9.3 billion in broadband funds of $16 billion that was available. So they got what they wanted for much cheaper than they originally preparing to. And in fact, service was offered in 5.2 million of the locations. 5.9 million locations or homes, so to speak, had been targeted. So a large chunk served for a much lower budget, and a lot of this kind of factored into people really bid the prices down, right? And so the bottom line conclusion is you're not likely to be able to build a network just on RDOF funding or any particular source. So that kind of brings us to the financing piece that we want to talk sort of front and center about. So Greg, let me turn to you first and say, what are the financial considerations and models that any type of entity, co-ops or others, need to bear in mind when you're considering a rural broadband project of the sort that NRTC supports? Would you be willing to take that question, Greg?
Yeah, sure. We sort of recommend a three-step process. Starting with the feasibility, I think just anybody who's deciding to build a broadband network who hasn't done it before has to start with, well, generally, what is it going to take to actually build the network out? So, it goes by different names. I'm sure, Ed's business and Ryan's, Lori's, others have different names for it. We call it a feasibility study. And it's actually a high-level view of all of the different elements and costs necessary to build a network. And that's important just to give you a general idea of how much it's going to cost to pass the homes within the areas that the company wants to try to serve. But it is not something to base a budget on. And so we feel it's critical that once you have a feasibility and it gives you a fair idea of what we're talking about, you got to go to a next step, which we call an EPP. It's really a more detailed project plan that really lays out in very specific details a more budget oriented plan. And that gets into the try to get away from the averages that you would typically see in a feasibility. And I can tell you that beware of averages, especially in broadband, because we actually did a broadband benchmarking study a couple of months ago for 36 electric cooperatives who had actually been in the business of building and running networks over the last couple of years. And we saw pretty wide ranges between everything from overhead per mile costs to underground per mile costs, make ready costs. So the averages were quite wide. The medians were also quite different than the averages. So just have to be super careful with averages. So we take this approach of having an EPP, which then gives you much more specifics about the actual plant that has to be built and gets costs aligned with each of the major elements of the project plan. And then, of course, at that point, you could probably set yourself a budget, but then you have to track the budget. And tracking the budget is super important because things change after the project gets kicked off, which obviously is the case. And being able to have a very tight change order process with whoever your your project manager and developer is, that will allow you, as you make decisions and change things that were in your project plan, that those things can then get incorporated into the new plan, and then the changes in the budget can be reflected, and then you can track it more effectively. So we think those are the three things that anybody who's trying to do this needs to go through and be real careful of, and not skip any of those steps, and make sure there's a tight process in each of those areas.
You know, fabulous framework. And just to be clear and iron it out, feasibility, EPP, which stands for, I assume, project plan. Could you just spell out the EPP there?
Yeah, basically it's executive project plan.
Executive project plan.
Project plan, and then and then change order process for managing it once you start kicking off the project.
Okay, well, whatever they're particularly called, you have a kind of an initial a plan and a budgetary. I'd love to get Ed and Lori and Ryan's reactions to this framework, and feel free to kind of delve into slightly different details, because again, the thought process we're trying to tackle is the budgeting in the midst of a project that has a budget that, at least a subsidy from RDOF, that may not cover by any stretch the entire fund. So you clearly got a lot of RDOF winners who have gone through the short form process. They've gone through the bidding. There's still the long form that remains for those entities, and as they get ready to execute their projects, what are some of the things that those types of entities need to keep in mind? So Ed, Lori, and Ryan.
So I'll take a first cut at that. I think, Greg, your advice is spot on. The use of averages. I mean, in fact, you heard me very specifically say planning studies, not feasibility, because I think feasibility has gotten a bit of a bad little bit of bad mojo in the industry based on kind of the use and the accuracy of some of those numbers. And I think right now, Drew, what we're seeing is, it's particularly concerning if people are using averages and other details in their planning process, because I think the macro trends that we all talked about at the beginning of this event really are going to start affecting things, right? So, the timing of turn up of customers in your business plan, maybe in the past you could assume 5 months from start of construction you're turning up, and maybe that's still true, but if you've got a let's say that number with all the fiber that's going to need to be ordered goes to 7 or 8 or 9 months, and suddenly you had a business plan that said, we're going to turn up customer 1 in 6 months, and instead it's 9 months, and the lead times get longer and prices begin to increase. Because I think the other thing that people should be concerned about as they're planning the execution of these projects is, there's a lot of capacity in our industry for things like engineering, for things like construction, but we already, probably with the AT&Ts and the Verizons and the 5G projects that have been going on, we probably are already, we're hearing the stories about crews disappearing on a Friday, not showing back up on Monday, and deferring projects. That's real right now, because there's not a lot of excess capacity. And, when there's not a lot of excess capacity, pricing is going to get a lot more inelastic. People are going to bid fewer projects. You're going to have fewer competitors on a project, and pricing of your construction phase and other services, I think, you're unless you get a supply chain really well locked in, you're really putting yourself in some cases at risk of seeing those prices increase as you begin to go from planning through what Greg called a more formal, detailed project plan. So those would be a couple of the things that I would certainly encourage people to look out for right now.
Thanks, Lori.
Great, and I'll pick up where you left off there and say, these the network builds that folks are looking at, particularly with RDOF, with CAF, they're 6 to 8 year builds to meet those milestones and requirements. And so, over the cost of those 6 to 8 years, construction is just going to keep increasing, in addition to the costs that Ed mentioned for labor and crews and materials and all of that. Just overall, we know that it increases every year. And so, where do you find those efficiencies? At Render, our motto is we build networks better. And so I think, as an industry, we need to look at how we can find efficiencies and be smarter in our deployment, whether that's using new tools and technologies. For example, Render's geospatial construction management platform enables you to capture that geolocating data that you need for reporting purposes for RDOF while you're deploying your network, so that you don't have to go back later to capture that data. So we need to think about deploying networks in ways that keep those crews engaged and active and moving and working, so that you reduce that risk of them leaving the job on a Friday night because they got a better offer for a different project that keeps them working 40 hours a week at a higher rate. So, I think looking at your deployment plan is critical to success here, particularly given all of the challenges that are facing our industry with these shortages and talent. It's an issue, and we're going to have to deal with those in those deployment plans. So we need to be looking at all the tools and things that we can use to shift our thinking and build these networks better.
Thank you. Ryan.
Yeah, the resource constraints that the other panelists have mentioned are real. And I think an instructive example is if we look around the world at other markets. In the UK, the last few years, building out new fiber networks has exploded. There's been a large number of smaller entities that are building out fiber networks, all trying to do it at the same time, which is very similar to what we're going to have as people get started on RDOF networks here. And they're having all of those same kind of constraints that the panelists are warning about here have been actually happening in the UK and to some extent in the larger European market. And that's really the constraining factor on the speed of fiber builds in the UK right now is construction people resources. Another factor, talking about the lead time for when you start building to getting revenue off of the network on the technology side, to make sure that you're positioned to offer the right set of services to get the maximum revenue out of that network once you get it stood up. If you look at traditional incumbent telcos and cable operators, what they've been living for the last several years, sort of in the Netflix era, is having large cloud providers like Netflix or Amazon Prime or Hulu come in and monetize their network on top of them and basically turn them into commodity bit pushers that move bits from over here to over here. But having a robust technology infrastructure that allows you to offer more value-added services on top of that broadband pipe, like a managed Wi-Fi service, which is even more important as you have higher speed broadband. Back when we had 10 and 20 meg broadband, you could have really lousy in-home Wi-Fi and it would still be better than your broadband connection. At 1 gig, that's not possible anymore. The in-home Wi-Fi is really the constraint in the delivery point. And so there's revenue opportunities there in having something like a managed Wi-Fi service that can go in and put different mesh Wi-Fi devices in the house to make sure that the home is blanketed with coverage, give the customer an easy to use app on their phone so that they can manage their devices and parental controls and things like that. All of those are additional revenue opportunities over and above the just basic broadband pipe that can help you more quickly monetize that network and get a larger revenue stream flowing once you have the network built out and activated in an area.
That's an important point. Let's keep that in mind. I want to make sure we kind of deal with some of the aspects of RDOF that people are talking about. So I'm going to share a screen here. This is the top 10 winners in the reverse auction by subsidy amount and the technologies that they have stated in their short form applications that they were going to use. And there's been a lot of talk over the last week about some of these entities, right, that are here. Some were kind of dark horses, but expected to make a play. Others have, kind of just sort of appeared here. And a lot of the discussion revolves around, are these people going to be able to deliver what they've stated? And so I want to at least invite the discussion on this, right? Because we are wanting to understand how you, if you are building a project, you're going to do it in the best capacity possible. So let me go ahead and stop the share of the screen and invite our panelists to weigh in on some of the discussions that have happened over the last week. And then we are beginning to get some questions in here from our audience that I'll turn to shortly. So who would like to go first?
So I can start. I think one of the interesting things that we've seen is the number of wireless providers at the gigabit tier. To date, there are technologies for fixed wireless at the gigabit speed. I think unless we're talking about kind of unusual niche type situations, the cost of those technologies may not be meaningfully lower than a full fiber network. I think if looking holistically, there are certainly places for fixed wireless in high speed networks that are for some reason it's very time consuming or difficult because of terrain, either natural terrain or human terrain, or permitting processes or things like that, where it might be difficult or expensive to get fiber, particularly in the the last few hundred feet where fixed wireless can be really valuable. I think it's going to be interesting to see how these bidders who are doing either largely fixed wireless with gigabit or a mix of gigabit and fiber, see how those networks turn out, and whether the assumptions that they made about the relative percentages of those two really bear out in the reality of the network. I think that's going to be one interesting thing to take a look at.
I think, Drew, the other thing, and we're probably all going to be relatively circumspect in our conversation about winners and losers in this auction. But I think that Brian, I agree with you completely. There's absolutely a place for fixed wireless. I think the technologies have evolved meaningfully over the last 5 years. I think it's no longer sort of a last resort option. And yet, I think there are questions, Drew, in many cases around not only how will the technology be deployed, but at the funding levels that have been awarded. How are the numbers working for some of these large grants, and particularly in some cases, some of the larger awardees receive pretty monumental sums of money with not a large infrastructure in place to support that. So I know Chris Mitchell's written a number of good articles. I respect the work that he does, and has certainly questioned to a certain extent how maybe some of the scale of the awardees may affect their ability to digest these dollars, and in some cases how they're managing to make the financial models work in areas where local incumbents haven't. So those to me are the questions out there. I think hopefully over the next 2 months or 2.5 months before long forms come in and final awards are made, it'll be interesting to see how many of these were plays for, sort of, a little Oklahoma sooner, let's make the land grab, then we'll decide what we want to do. I think we could see some of that. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some of that.
And one thing too also is that absolutely it'll be interesting to compare this list, Ed, with the final award list to see what those differences are. Every one of these needs to have a project plan. I mean, the long form is a pretty complicated process. It requires a lot of information, and so it's interesting to see what that final list will be. But as far as, you have to keep in mind that this money is supposed to be a subsidy. And so part of the requirements are that you have to have enough funding for, I think it's 2 years of operations. and 2 years worth of funding on these projects aside from the subsidy. And so presumably everyone bidding has their financial plan, knows what their requirements are in terms of additional funding to help them meet these high cost builds. But this is not as much money as we were anticipating was going to be handed out for areas that are high cost. And so, I think the proof is in the pudding, to use an overused expression, but we'll see what happens when these long forms are finally submitted in that list of projects are accepted and written in stone.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a dichotomy between giving away less money at lower cost to serve high cost areas, and especially using wireless technology for gigabit. We have a ton of experience deploying wireless for consumer and business broadband, and at both millimeter wave as well as lower bands. And you cannot underestimate how challenging and difficult it is to be able to get a true high-speed capability to rural areas based on the issues Ryan mentioned, terrain and trees and other issues. Obviously, some areas are easier than others, but it's a significant challenge. But technology exists. It's certainly possible to do it. It's just a matter of how it can be done and how long it'll take, and whether or not it actually achieves the goals that the different entities have. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Lori raised a very interesting point a moment ago about each of these awardees who have bid and received the award tentatively needed to have or need to now put together a project plan as part of the long form. Could you just talk a little bit more about that, Lori, as well as the others, and maybe tie it into this framework that we heard from by Greg earlier on, which is the feasibility phase, the detailed executive project plan, the budget. How does one do that, and what are some of the tools you need to do that effectively, Lori and the others?
Well, hopefully, as a part of their planning process, that they did already do a feasibility study or a budget and have all of their numbers crunched, because now is not the time to start that process. Now that you're in the thick of it, you have to know where you stand and how much buffer you have between your bottom line and making a profit and losing money, and what that ROI is. Some of this is putting together a project plan entails not just determining, putting a stake in the ground and saying, okay, we're going to build out to here in year 1 and here in year 2 and here in year 3. I mean, that's kind of an easy thing to just take a first stab at. It becomes a lot more difficult when you're factoring into that materials shortages and revenue and income and all of those things that factor into those build out plan. And so when when you're putting together that project plan, you have to be thinking about all of these different variables, as well as how you're going to meet those reporting requirements, which are not insignificant. You need the geospatial, geolocation information of homes and premises passed. You need, all sorts of information for hub reporting. And how are you going to capture that efficiently? There's some lessons learned from CAF 1 and CAF 2, from a lot of companies that have not met their project plan and their deployment schedule. And we know this based on news articles of, folks that were not able to reach out to the 95% and during the time frame that they were required to do it. And so really, the project plan will make or break you. And so, I encourage everyone who's working on that component now for these long forms to really think about all of these different elements, because all of these variables, it's not just simply determining which area, which census blocks, which 100% of the census blocks you're going to meet what year. It's the collective amount of all this information that you have to deal with in the project plan.
Do others have feedback on this point about sort of the project plan aspect and how you make it work in a project that your subsidy is not going to cover your complete costs? Brian or Ed or Greg, you want to add more to this point?
Well, certainly from a technology perspective, there's a lot of planning that has to go into your long form response around the really proving that the network that you're going to build with this subsidy and whatever money that you put on top of it, outside of the financial considerations, is actually capable of providing the service in the tier that you bid for and promise. So there's a lot of technology details around capacity and oversubscription and how is the network built out to prove to the FCC that, yes, if I'm signing up to get a subsidy for a gigabit service, that I'm actually going to be able to deliver it. And also, add to that, what we're seeing come into effect with the new year for CAF2 recipients, which will be a reality for RDOF recipients later as well, actually doing in-network performance testing to prove that yes, Mr. FCC, you gave me the money to build this network to these performance specifications, and I'm actually providing that to the real customers in the real network. So there are a lot of technology planning considerations that go into that, along with the execution type considerations around project planning and contractor management and all of those things.
Yeah, Drew, I would just add on top of what Ryan has said, it relates back to maybe some of the swirl in the industry that we're hearing about these awards are. It relates back to the FCC and sort of the validation and verification of actual deployment and realization of results. I think there always are questions about how are these dollars being spent, and are they affecting the type of change that the FCC is looking for in terms of reliable speed increases? Are they sort of disappearing as subsidies into existing entities without So I think there are questions out there that I think people have concerns about, and very real concerns about. If a committed speed is being promised, do we have a validation mechanism to ensure that that's being tested and verified? And are there going to be appropriate penalties and clawbacks for organizations that have made promises that they haven't delivered on? And I think from a conceptual perspective, I think that's been lacking in a lot of the federal funding, and something that personally I'd like to see more of. But I haven't seen a lot of appetite for that under the current FCC, but perhaps that changes come new administration and new year.
We got a question here earlier on from David Costin about the contribution factor is now over 30%. It's 31.8%. This is, of course, the Universal Service Fund requirement for telecommunications services. David asks, with Commissioner O'Reilly gone, who long opposed reform extension of contribution, is there any chance of preventing the system from collapsing? Obviously, broadband is not subject to contribution, but telecommunications services, in order to be an RDOF winner, you need to get eligible telecommunications carrier certification. And this certainly does impact the question. I'm just wondering if any of our panelists would like to take this question. 31.8 is just an exceptionally large fee to be adding to any telecommunications service. How are you seeing that impacting the entities you're working with? Or, Greg, as you're modeling the efforts that the electric and telecommunications co-ops are doing, how does this number affect budgets that you are working with, Greg?
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other topic. I don't know that we have a lot of time to go into, but suffice to say that a lot of the universal service issues, the changes that have been made over the last several years in terms of the funding mechanisms and how it's supporting current telecom companies and their desire to expand their networks to be able to achieve greater penetration of better service. And it's been a struggle. It's been a struggle, especially for small rural telecom providers who've actually wanted to be able to serve their communities with better broadband, but because of the change in the subsidy structure and the amount of money available, and then having to compete against other players who are trying to come in and pitch potentially challenging engineering solutions to get gig service, and having to compete against all that, and actually still end up at the end of the day giving better service to to the communities. It's been a struggle. So obviously, CARES helped. RDOF will help to some degree, but I don't think we can wave the flag and say, "Wow, RDOF was a great success," because we're only spending $9 billion, which is still a small amount of money that's necessary. And hopefully, the legislation and FCC and others will look to move really quickly to do RDOF phase 2, take the money, roll it into that, and then get address level understanding of actual service and do that quickly. And if in that case, I think that'll certainly flesh out whether or not anybody's actually delivering what they said they were going to deliver, open up some additional census blocks, more money, and certainly any other additional infrastructure money that might become available from the new administration. All will be great things, but it's got to be done. It's got to be done quickly. The need is there now. Having this thing play out for another 6 or 7 years and then realizing we're still not there is just not acceptable.
I just wanted to pick up on the last sentence you said there about additional monies that might come from an infrastructure build. How are you thinking about that right now? Obviously, this USF does raise a complete other kettle of fish, but in terms of thinking through what if there were to be a major infrastructure bill with substantial funding for broadband, would you recommend kind of doing the same thing that has been done with RDOF, or are there other lessons to be learned based on this experience? Greg first, but others as well. Comment on that.
Probably because we're still in the quiet period, I'll get myself in trouble depending on how much I say about this. But just if I say, we've got to look at what worked in this and what didn't work. Obviously, we've all talked about some of the issues with this particular process, and who got a lot of money that ultimately may not end up meeting the needs. So I think you got to look very, very carefully at that before we take the rules from this one and apply it to the next one. I think we can learn a lot and hopefully improve on it, just like improving over CAF 2. So suffice to say that the hope is let's move quickly. Let's make sure that these long form submissions are responsible and meet the goal. And if they're not, obviously call folks on the carpet for it. And then once this is over, get moving on some of these other opportunities.
Great. Lori, do you want to jump in on some aspects of deployment strategies?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot that's on the table in terms that folks can look at in terms of lowering your financial risk through your deployment strategies. And whether it's looking at contractors who have buying power to secure those materials and resources that are in need, but also people need to think about the amount of funding that's going to be released as well over the next couple of years. All of the billions of dollars that will be coming out potentially as a result of new legislation, state grants, other grants, Healthcare Connect funds. All of these additional funds are going to put strain and stress on the system. So your deployment strategies and your plan really needs to look over the next 10 years and make some assumptions based on what we know today. But also in terms of planning, again, I think just stressing about just being a little bit smarter, figuring out ways to create those efficiencies, collecting the data you need as you go along in the process, rather than going back for it after the fact, making sure that while you're engaged in permitting and pole attachment agreements, you're implementing parts of your build that you can do aside from that. So, we've run into some projects that received CAF 1 and CAF 2 funding that got into trouble because they were looking at everything kind of on a linear timeline, where you do the permitting first, then you do the engineering and the permitting, and it's all A, B, C, D, E. And really, I think the biggest deployment strategy that you can implement is one that is simultaneous, where you're taking on your tasks and you're deploying your resources where you can along the way, rather than waiting for one particular thing to be completed before you move to the next thing. You know, you have to look at this as kind of a simultaneous process and not a linear one.
Thank you.
Lori, just one comment that I'll add on that, and this is a bit of a trend that we've started to see with some of our clients, and I don't know if this will be a movement or if it's a couple of data points that you can't connect dots. But one of the things that we've started seeing is, that there is more urgency, I think, whether you're receiving grant funds or not. I think ISPs, providers are beginning to think more aggressively about expansion, largely in response to the macro stuff that's happening, right? There's just, leaving kids unable to do homework in communities doesn't sit well with a lot of providers, right? So we're seeing companies begin to develop bigger plans where maybe they were doing 4,000 service points a year as part of an expansion plan. They're looking to press the accelerator to 3, 4, or 5 times that. And those are companies that maybe aren't receiving federal money, but just are making a commitment to deploy faster. I think we're seeing that. We're seeing companies that are receiving these funds that now have more aggressive builds. And one of the things that we've seen is companies moving away from that traditional kind of design, bid, build model and looking for more turnkey design, build partnerships, sort of, groups that are able to come with a full solution. They have national scale, they've got purchasing power to address some of those challenges, not by insourcing it and doing more internally, but by outsourcing. And there's a little more cost there in some cases than it is to do it internally. But some of our clients, particularly the smaller ones, just don't have the internal capacity to ramp into this. So it may not be a trend. It may be a couple of isolated data points, but we're seeing maybe more and more of that in terms of changes in the model.
What are the things that most throw off a budget in a project of this sort, and the things that and what do you do now to kind of guard against those issues that throw budgets off track?
We actually asked that specific question in the broadband benchmarking study that we did, and I'll kind of give you the list of things that came up in that. Probably the CapEx, did it actually hit the original feasibility or project plan? Probably, and generally it was higher than everybody. I think 76% said CapEx ended up higher. And it was either because permitting costs, make-ready costs, especially for electrics, is a big issue. Their ratio of underground overhead or the amount of rock that they hit, and things like that can make a huge difference in a budget. Sometimes maybe underrepresenting what it takes to do drops, which of course is an issue, whether or not it's fiber or wireless. Number of wireless sites, typically that gets underplanned a lot, and it needs to be thought through, because that can blow a budget as well. So there's quite a long list of topics that contribute to a budget being challenged on the CapEx front. But we've also seen good, almost all of them said, hey, our take rates were higher, our ARPUs were higher, and other things, which sort of compensates a little bit of that once you actually get into the business. But definitely assume, be conservative in your budgeting.
Okay, we're quickly running out of time. I know Ryan has a comment you'd like to make. Let's hear from you, Ryan, and then open it up to any final quick thoughts from any of the panelists before we cut it off. So Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. On the budget front, I think one thing that particularly people who are building networks who are not used to operating networks can tend to underestimate is the support cost. If you're used to people calling you because a tree has fallen on the power line, that's very different from my kids' Zoom class didn't work very well at 10:30 a.m. yesterday. Can you help me out? What happened there? That can be a cost problem, whether you're insourcing that support or outsourcing it to somebody else. And that's another area where these newer technology solutions that can improve Wi-Fi coverage, but also coordinate that coverage and use newer techniques like AI and machine learning to adapt the Wi-Fi environment inside the home to solve problems before they come up or before they're noticed and before they generate a call is not only a great way to reduce your support costs, but improve customer satisfaction as well.
Well, with that, we're going to have the last word. We appreciate you being with us. This is, again, one of a continuation of discussions that we are having on tools for broadband deployment. The next one, January 27th, we'll be talking about mapping and GIS tools in particular, and we'll have a whole new group of people in that discussion. I also want to remind you that next week on the 23rd, we're going to have a Broadband Breakfast Live Online holiday party for those of you who'd like to join. We're going to hear reports from around the country about broadband projects from 2020, and the week following, we'll be hearing projections and hopes for the coming year. Thanks for being with us. I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast, and see you next Wednesday at 12.